so next up we have Phillip McKenna. Okay, so he is going to talk about a review of remote sensing of post-mine rehabilitation for ecological outcomes. And hopefully, all going well. No, not the last one, don't worry.
A couple after me.
Okay.
Thanks, Phoebe.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. So today I'm presenting part of my literature review for my PhD. So this is a review paper that was published last year. The title of my talk is Remote Sensing of Mine Site Rehabilitation for Ecological Outcomes. And I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Alex Lechner, Stuart Finn, and Peter Erskine. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship on the lands on which we meet, and also the lands on which this research has taken place. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So in Australia and across the world, there's some general key goals for mine site rehabilitation, and that is for it to be safe, stable, self-sustaining and non-polluting. And in Australia, mining companies are required to progressively rehabilitate the land following mining. And some of these areas are quite significant. So for example, in Queensland, there's estimated over 220,000 hectares of disturbed mine footprint. And in Western Australia, more than 3.2 million hectares of active mining lease. So of this land that needs to be rehabilitated, one of the things that needs to happen is to use an effective and robust and efficient way to monitor these developing ecosystems. Typically, these have been achieved through ground-based monitoring with teams actually on the ground measuring in transects or plots and using quadrats and measuring metrics such as species richness, tree and shrub density and height, vegetation cover and biomass. But remote sensing is also playing a part and has a big part to play in the future of monitoring of developing ecosystems. Mining industry is at an interesting place at the moment where they're very interested in new monitoring methods that not only can look at fine plant scale, but also across the landscape scale. And there's remote sensing options for that in the future. So we conducted a review to look at the past 50 years, from 1970 to 2019, and we reviewed 99 papers, and they had to be published and peer reviewed. They had to have a focus on the remote sensing component of measuring post-mining landscapes with a focus on vegetation and ecology. We wanted to look at the trends of ecological assessments in mine site rehabilitation and also review the sensors, locations, resources and methods. And in terms of results, there's three graphs there. At the top, and you can see an increasing trend of number of publications over time from 1970 through to 2019, with the majority of publications happening in the last decade. So at the top is country of study, and the middle graph there is commodity, and the bottom graph there is craft. And going back up the top, if you see the country United States is most highly represented initially from the 1970s onwards, but in the last decade there's been much more diversity of number of countries using remote sensing to assess mine site rehabilitation. In terms of commodity, most of this has been conducted on mine site, on coal mine rehabilitation, but again in the last decade we're seeing more studies on different types of rehabilitated ecosystems. And in terms of craft, Landsat series of satellites have been used most extensively, but in the last couple of years, in the last 10 years, we've seen the introduction of drones and also high spatial and temporal resolution satellite sensors. In terms of study site and land cover assessment type studies were the most highly represented, followed by ecological type studies that interestingly enough used field observations, which is quite interesting because often a lot of remote sensing studies don't actually have ground ground data to validate their findings. So it was interesting that so many had ground data. In terms of the sensor use, as I mentioned before, Earth observation high, which is Landsat 30 metre and bigger pixel resolution, was the most highly represented. And spatial extent, the site scale, so the whole mine site scale, was the most dominant study type, but regional as well, looking at multiple mine sites. And block scale was also reasonably well represented. So block scale, I mean single age class or one parcel of land, which could be anywhere from 10, 20 hectares up to 200 hectares. Temporal scale, unitemporal scale, which is using one image in the study, was the most highly represented, but so too was bitemporal, multi-temporal, and also decadal across multiple decades. And classification method, supervised classification method, was the most common, followed by manual. This is a alluvial chart. So this shows the whole spread of the data that was collected through the review. And just to point out a few things there. So the columns there are the variables and the rows are the categories. The length of this node here indicates the proportion of data. So there's more studies in the 2010 to 2019 decade. And I'll just flow through this for you. So most of this 2010 to 2019 studies were conducted in Australia and China and the USA. The ones that were in USA were mostly conducted on rehabilitated coal mines, and moving further across the sensor type, these were mostly conducted at Earth observation low and at the site scale, and with the temporal scale looking at unitemporal, so single image, and with classification method, mostly it's supervised. And then the last two columns, I'll talk a bit more in the next slides, but these are the Society for Ecological Restoration attributes from the recovery wheel, which I'll talk about. But I just wanted to point out that most of the data, so we ranked each of the studies depending on which attribute they most closely addressed. And most of the studies fell into the structural diversity attribute, and most of those fell into the spatial mosaic. So, and this is the ecological recovery wheel. Some of you will know this. It was designed by the Society for Ecological Restoration as a tool to compare restoration projects with analog ecosystems. We used this in a slightly different way where, as I said before, we ranked or classed each study based on which sub-attribute and attribute they addressed. And so this left-hand side wheel then is what we found in the review. So the historical remote sensing studies overwhelmingly addressed this spatial mosaic sub-attribute. So essentially they're land cover studies. There were other studies that addressed productivity and cycling, landscape flows, but overall the rest of the sub-attributes are either poorly represented or not represented at all. So then we asked, well, what is the capacity and the option or the potential for remote sensing to address each of those sub-attributes? And we came up with the recovery wheel on the right, where you can see if it got a scale of 5, that is highly compatible with remote sensing to address or measure or quantify these sub-attributes. And 16 out of the 18 sub-attributes we feel remote sensing can contribute to in some way for mine site rehabilitation. And I'll just step through each of those. It's probably a bit hard to see that top right table there, but I've got a number of sensors, and they're color coded for what the most appropriate sensor is, we think, for measuring these sub-attributes. So the species composition, desirable plants and non-desirable species are well suited to remote sensing with using unique spectral signatures and unique coloring, vertical height, shape and canopy arrangement of the desirable and non-desirable plants. Desirable animals can be detected using thermal imagery. So that's, for example, kangaroos, koalas and feral pigs. And just to give you an example there of a non-desirable species. So here's an example of drone imagery measuring Parkinsonia, which is a weed of significance in central Queensland. And in this case, individual canopies of Parkinsonia have been segmented and identified. And in this occasion, the mining company has been provided with XY coordinates of all the individuals of Parkinsonia in that block of land, so management can then apply their weed management techniques. Structural diversity and all vegetation strata. So key species in the canopy, mid-story and ground level are well suited for remote sensing. And spatial mosaic obviously is a very common assessment technique for remote sensing, so land cover assessments. And also point clouds derived from LiDAR sensors are well suited to measuring different vegetation strata. Ecosystem function, so productivity and cycling, vegetation growth, figure, nutrient cycling are highly suited to using a whole range of different active and passive sensors to measure those. Habitat and interactions, plant biomass has been used to measure, has been measured using synthetic aperture radar, or SAR. And something I'm particularly interested in for my PhD is the measurement of resilience and in mine site rehabilitation, and that's best suited using time series imagery. And here's an example of an area in central Queensland that was burnt, a patch of rehabilitation on a coal mine. It's been captured with drone imagery across the whole time series from pre-fire on the left, post-fire, 6 months post-fire, 12 months post-fire, and then on the far right, 2 years post-fire. That white circle there across time is a shrub called Atriplex nummularia, which is common across the site, or old man saltbush. And you can see over time it's actually reduced in number and distribution over the site. So 2 years after the fire, we're seeing widespread deaths of this individual, which is going to impact on the resilience of the site. Here's another example of measuring resilience with a time series. This time it's using planet satellite imagery. This is from a rehabilitated mineral sand mine in southeast Queensland. And so this is using NDVI and looking at 3 different vegetation communities over time. And before the fire, which is the red dotted line, you can see there's 3 different communities, and they're all responding in a similar way to seasonal changes and daily rainfall, which is the blue bar chart. Post-fire, you see a divergence of the different communities. So burnt swamp, burnt eucalypt community, and burnt rehabilitation in purple. They drop off from the rest, and burnt swamp recovers quite quickly, but then in the 2 years following, burnt rehabilitation and burnt eucalypt have a much slower, recovery and still haven't reached pre-fire levels 2 years after the fire. And external exchanges, so habitat links and landscape flows are well suited to a whole range of different sensors. So landscape flows and habitat links, so things like fire and heat flux are well suited to a range of sensors, and also ecological connections, so wildlife corridors and offsets between rehabilitated and unmined vegetation. Absence of threats, so contamination, invasive species and overutilisation. Again, a whole range of sensors can potentially measure these sub-attributes. So identifying and managing weeds using distinctive colour and shape, such as Parkinsonia and Athelpine, which I'll talk about in a moment. And contamination's been measured in a few different studies. One particular study was looking at mineral accumulation on foliage from uranium-bearing dust from the tailings dams using hyperspectral imagery. And in terms of invasive species, this is another example. This is Athelpine, which is an invasive weed in parts of central Queensland. And in this case, we've measured canopy perimeter using a GPS, and then use those to calibrate and validate a classification model to then determine the locations of all the Athelpine. and physical conditions. So soil wasn't part of the review, or soil studies that focused on soil weren't really part of the review, but remote sensing does have a role to play for measuring. One of the things with rehabilitation is the high heterogeneity in soil and spoils, which makes remote sensing at broad scales quite difficult. But certainly synthetic aperture radar and hyperspectral and thermal sensors have the capability to measure a range of different soil metrics. And common in the mining industry is measuring landform stability using LiDAR and drone-related derived point cloud. And then if you put it all together, we've got the ecological recovery wheel, but then another circle on the outside with sensors and a related sensor code suggesting which sensor would be best suited to measuring that sub-attribute. And last slide, thanks. So summary now. So from the review, historically, there's been a limited range of ecological attributes addressed with a historical focus mainly on land cover studies. As I mentioned before, so one of the common themes running through the review was a lot of studies talking about how heterogeneous mine site rehabilitation is as a remote sensing target. And you can see, here's an example of a coal mine on the right-hand side. So each of these discrete patches of vegetation might be a different age class. It might have different site preparation techniques, different topsoil types, different topsoil depths, different seeding applied to it. So as a target, it's very complex for remote sensing. Just to comment that increases in vegetation cover does not equate to rehabilitation success, which some of the studies use as a bit of a justification for a successful rehabilitated outcome, but that's obviously not the case. And the ecological recovery wheel details how complex some of these monitoring and how many metrics you can actually use to determine successful rehabilitation and restoration efforts. And also, remote sensing is not a silver bullet, so ground points are still required to calibrate and validate remote sensing outputs. And that's it. Thank you.
You'll hear me all right? You can, eh? So thank you very much, Phillip. We have time for one question if anybody's got one. Otherwise, we'll move on. Is there any questions?
Yep.
Okay, quick one.
Phill, I noted with the recommended remote sensors, there was no use of camera traps. Is that just because it's hard to gauge a good idea of how many numbers there are for animals passing through those camera traps, or is just the thermal imagery a bit better for that?
Yeah, so we haven't really used ground. I've put in terrestrial ground-based LiDAR, but I haven't used things like camera traps. But I guess you could actually include that in terms of desirable animals. You could use camera traps. Yeah, the study didn't include camera traps like that for picking up animals. So yeah.
That's all I've got, Phill. Sorry, mate.
That's right.
Probably for the best.
Right.
All right. Thank you very much, Phillip.